To the contents live on the YouTube.
We are live.
Oh, nice. Maybe I have to refresh. Live on the. Yep, cool. We're live on the YouTube. Hi everyone. Well, thanks for joining us again. We're doing this live Q&A session with me and Gerard as part of the AppSync Masterclass. So yeah, just let us know your questions, put them in the comments, and I'll try to answer them as quickly as we can, or as many of them as we can. I guess maybe a quick update on the AppSync Masterclass from both me and Gerard. I'm still finishing up the last couple of lessons on the AppSync caching, so I should be uploading those videos this week, and then I will be moving on to the, I think, chapter 8, and yeah, so Gerard, any updates on your end?
Yeah, I'm gonna move now to the profile page, and that's the last bit. So yeah, looking forward to finish my chapter.
And then Gerard can start working on the next front end chapter 7 to go along with all the changes that we've been making in the chapter 6 in the backend. So I guess okay, let's see, I've got some questions coming through here already. So I've got a question from, let's see, this is quite a common question. I got a question from Eduardo here. It says, on real world scenarios, do you create the separate accounts, managing them with AWS organization, or do you use a single account? So this is applicable to, I guess, to everybody, not just for people that are using AppSync or using Serverless or Lambda on the AWS. It's general best practice for you to use multiple accounts. Personally, I'll go with at least one account per team, per environment. So if you've got multiple teams in your organization, then you may want to use not just one account for separate environment, but also separate teams as well, so that different teams can essentially have a full autonomy over their environment, how they configure resources, and also importantly, if they make a mistake, they're not gonna then affect everybody else. One of the big reasons for having multiple accounts is that in terms of security, essentially you're installing this bulkhead so that if someone was to accidentally leak their AWS credentials, put them onto a GitHub public repo by mistake, which happens way more often than you probably realize. I've heard a few real-world instances of that happening, and in some cases, there were real financial consequences of those. But yeah, so if you accidentally did that, then if you have your environments in different accounts, then hopefully you didn't put your production account credentials into a public GitHub repo. And the other thing is that it helps you to mitigate a lot of the resource and the throughput limits you have. For every service AWS offers, so there are always going to be some resource limits in terms of how many of something you can have in a region. Like say, for example, the number of DiamondDB tables, the number of Kinesis streams, and the number of maybe not Lambda functions, but IAM roles. For example, I was working for a company called The Zone. Pretty large company, got a couple hundred engineers working full stack, and the AWS limit on the number of IAM roles you can have in a region, in a single region, it's about 5,000, which you think you never hit that, but we got there pretty quickly because you have so many different teams, so many different environments, different applications that they all need to use IAM roles. So having separate teams on their own environments, and then separate environments being different accounts, that really helps mitigate some of those shared limits you have on both the number of resources you can have, but also in terms of the number of throughputs you can have, like a number of concurrent executions for Lambda functions and things like that. So definitely recommended to use recommended for use in the real world scenarios. I've got a question from Michael here. How appropriate is the design to a large scaling system, both technical and cost? I guess when you say this design, I guess you're specifically talking about the approach we're using for the class. Well, I guess the main thing I'll probably mention is that with GraphQL, you got something that's quite a monolithic API essentially. So if you have a really large system with lots of different teams, that's where GraphQL has a separate mechanism to handling that, GraphQL Federation. I guess, Gerard, do you want to sort of talk through what that looks like, GraphQL Federation?
I haven't got anything on GraphQL Federation for this solution. But what are you interested in?
Yeah, so I think like for example, you wouldn't want you want different teams to own their part of the system, like their own API, their own databases, and all of that. And when you've got a monolithic system like GraphQL API in AppSync, then that can be problematic. And I think the way that people normally work around it in GraphQL is to use federation, so that you can have essentially part of your object graph being owned by one team, but then another part being owned by a different team, and then you have some ways to stitch them together. With AppSync, that's not possible because it doesn't support the federations. Sorry, you were going to say something, Gerard?
Yeah. There's few solutions to that, but then there's a little bit of hand crafting there. You can automate bits of that, but there's no like general solution, unfortunately. But yeah, people is using some libraries from open source. I can share some links, and that will give you that feature. But I was wondering if you were pointing to some new solution. But yeah, if that's not the case, then yeah, you need to rely on some like manual labor on your side, unfortunately, at this point. But there's ways to add federation.
Yeah, so with so right now, if you're running GraphQL with and you want to have federation, then the only way to do that kind of using serverless components is by running essentially GraphQL server inside Lambda function. And I know quite a few companies do that. In fact, I was talking to the guys at Cloud Guru, and that's what they're doing. They're using, I don't know if they're using federation, but they're running essentially a Polo server in Lambda. And the friend of mine who's working for a startup, but they are using federation with that approach. In terms of the other stuff we're using, like DiamondDB tables and all of that, that absolutely scales fine, and the cost is going to grow linearly. At some point, you may find that DiamondDB is quite expensive. So at that point, you may find that it's cheaper to run, say, a large database where you're paying for uptime. But that really depends on how much throughput you're talking about. DiamondDB at scale can be quite expensive. But that said, you don't have to use DiamondDB for every single part of your application. One of the things that you get with microservices is that you can choose the right technology for the right part of your application. So maybe some of it, maybe a lot of the data will be coming from, say, DiamondDB tables, but maybe some of them that are more relational and more complicated, maybe you put them still into a relational database, or because you prefer to pay for uptime because the throughput is so high that when you pay for individual requests on DiamondDB, it gets more expensive. I guess maybe circling back to GraphQL Federation for a bit. I know that that's one of the most requested features for AppSync, so I'm pretty sure that the AppSync team is going to be working on something. So reInvent is in 5 months' time. So I'm hoping there's to be something that gets announced there.
I shared a link with you on the chat. People can point to it if they want to get federation. That's what people is using.
Cool. So if you put that in the YouTube comments, I think people can see that right there.
All right, I'll do that. Let me see.
I've actually got quite a few questions around using AppSync and GraphQL with a single table design. So I had a chat with Alex Debris recently. You probably seen his book mentioned around the DiamondDB book mentioned somewhere, including on AppSync Masterclass. Even he said that when you're using AppSync, he doesn't recommend people using single table design, and the reason is that it makes all of your DiamondDB operations slightly more complicated in terms of having to write more custom VTL code to construct the sort key, and also having to take the results and pick them out. So you get, so from a single table design, you have lots of different entities in the same table. You make a single query, and then you get back an array of items. Some of them, one of them maybe for a customer, and then a bunch of other rows maybe for the orders for the customer. It's great that you can make them, you can get both data in one core, but then you have to get them out of that same items array in the response, and that means you have to write custom VTL code, and the VTL is not exactly everyone's cup of tea. So maybe when they introduce the JavaScript scripting language support for AppSync, they've been talking about it for a little while now, so I'm hoping to see that before reInvent this year. Then maybe it becomes more feasible for you to use a single table design. And just in general, if you listen to that podcast I did, I can find the link and then put it in the comments on the YouTube channel. There's a lot of reasons why you just wouldn't want to use single table designs in general, not just when you're using GraphQL. If you think about single table designs and why it's good, you've got at scale, you can get it can be more cost efficient by cutting down the number of requests you're making to DiamondDB, and you can potentially be getting better performance. But at the same time, you also you're losing a lot of things as well. For one thing, understanding the schema of your data becomes more difficult. Typically, you have to use some other tool like the NoSQL workbench that lets you model the data so that you understand what's actually in your database. And essentially, it also renders DiamondDB streams useless, or at least very difficult to use, because suddenly you're getting everything in the single stream, and if you just want one piece of data, or at least one type of data, it means there's something you have to filter in your own application code, which just makes consuming those updates from the DiamondDB streams much more difficult than it needs to be. Another thing is that there's just more complexity to understanding what data you have, and also the fact that when you need to introduce a new way to query your data, because you have so many different entities in the same table, you often have to use many different global secondary indices to support the different query models you have. Guess what? CloudFormation can only update one global secondary index in one deployment at a time. So which means that if you are doing changes and you have to update, you end up have to add the two different global secondary index, because you're adding two type of entities in the same table, and you need to use a different global secondary index to query them. Then you have to be really careful in terms of how you roll out those changes in terms of your CI/CD pipeline, so that those updates happens one at a time, as opposed to you trying to update two indices, GSIs in one go, in which case the CloudFormation is going to say, sorry, I can't do that, and then you're going to stuck in your pipeline, which is not a great place to be. So I'm going to put a link, so have a listen of my conversation with Alex Sabri on that.
Yeah, I have few comments while you are typing that information. So I would say that if you want to use a single table design, you must have a very stable schema at that time. Because every time that you go through changes to the way you access your data, that's gonna have an impact on how the data is stored. So if you have a high volume of data, that's gonna require a migration from one version of the schema to another version, and that's gonna become kind of a hurdle if you have to go through different changes. So if you are iterating your data schema or how you access your data, you don't want to be using a single table design. You probably want to use that for very stable solutions where you know what how you access the data, and this is not going to change, at least not that often.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, a lot of the talks you've probably seen people, well, maybe not people, because mostly I see Rick Houlihan and Alex Debris give about the single table designs and examples they give. Most of that examples are, okay, these are not a fresh solution. This is migrating from an existing application where those access patterns are known. And you're doing this as a way to optimize your performance or cost. And not when you're building a new application, you're still figuring out your access patterns, how you use the data, the schema of your data. No, those kind of changes are harder to stomach when you're using single table design on top of that as well. Yeah, I guess the single table design, as all things, is a tool. There's always a return on investment, and there's a cost as well for those decisions. Just understand, I'm not saying that single table design is the wrong choice. It absolutely depends on your use case, but understand the trade-offs in terms of complexity, in terms of cost, in terms of performance, but also in terms of the operational overhead is going to add to you, add to your team as well. So I'm not saying one way or another. I'm saying that you need to understand why use single table design or why not. I would say most of cases don't use it unless you absolutely need to scale the hell out of your application and try to minimize the cost. I think the cost benefits are, a lot of them is hypothetical. I guess we haven't seen many real world examples of how, okay, we move to a single table design for multi-table approach and how much our costs have changed. So I'd like to see some of that, but we haven't seen that yet. Got a suggestion here. Any plans to form a Slack or Discord channel for the course or discussion about serverless? That's a great shout. I've been meaning to do that since from the last time we had this live Q&A. Let me just put this in my
mental note.
Mental note. Yeah, mental note doesn't quite work when I jump my mind jumps between one thing to another so quickly. Let me just add something to my to-do list at Slack or Discord channel, AppSync Masterclass. As this is the only way I remember to do a lot of these things. I think maybe it was you, maybe it was someone else that suggested the same thing last time. I thought it was a great idea. Is there a plan to replace VTL with something? I think we mentioned it earlier that the AppSync team has been sort of hinting that they're going to introduce a JavaScript. Well, not hinting. They actually put out a RFC a couple of months ago, I think now, that they're going to introduce a JavaScript language instead of a VTL. Whether or not that's human compatible, I guess that depends. It's more familiar to more people. That's true. Human compatible, maybe not. I mean, VTL, once you get used to it, it's not so bad. But it's just unfamiliar. That's the thing. How do you find the VTL, Gerard?
I mean, I'm from the generation that use XML and XLST, so I really don't mind. I mean, I'm happy to use it, but yeah, it took me a few days to master it, and it was quite funky. But I don't know. I mean, I'm used to learn like strange things, but yeah, it's not the most natural language, let's say that. But it's a templating engine actually. So if you are familiar with Razor, coming from C# or I don't know any template engines, PHP or something like that, then it will feel closer. I think for the new generations, this is maybe too much. So maybe wait a little bit more.
Yeah, I think VTL is quite powerful as a templating language, but is a bit unusual if you're coming from JavaScript and you're not, because I mean it's written in Java, so there's a lot of the Java classes methods are available. That's actually quite helpful. But at the same time, if you never use Java, maybe it just doesn't, it's not as intuitive to you. And the fact that he's using a hash if and a hash else for those keywords, that's a bit unusual. I guess when you're used to languages like Node.js. But yeah, VTL is not everyone's cup of tea. I get that. So Michael says you use Algolia for hash searches. Why not DynamoDB? Well, we've so let's see, hash search. We could use the DynamoDB, but I think that's the. Which bit was this? This was the right. Okay, so you're talking about using maybe a global. So maybe you're putting a global secondary index on the hash. Well. Okay, so I guess the way you would do that with DiamondDB is you need to have a separate table that kind of maps the tweet IDs. Because the hashes is an array, you can't exactly use that as a primary key. So I don't see how you would do that with DiamondDB, at least not easily, because if you want to use that, then you have to put into the as a hash key for the table somehow, either as a new table, separate table, or as a global secondary key. And because the hashes that is captured from a tweet is an array, I don't think you can actually. I don't think you can use an array as a hash key. So I don't think that's actually going to work. And plus, we already use Algolia for search already, and Algolia supports the searching through an array. Pretty straightforward, as you saw in the course. So I think it just makes sense. I think anytime when you're using, anytime when you're doing search, like some kind of search-based service like Algolia or Elasticsearch, it should be what you'd be looking at. You can mimic it with DynamoDB and things like that, but usually you're making your life more difficult if you do that.
Yeah, I mean the search capabilities of DynamoDB are quite limited compared to Algolia or Elasticsearch. It's just because there's no tokenization, there's no indexing, there's no I mean we're talking about years and years of development from these specific databases for indexation. So it's nothing you can replace easily. And then there's also the fuzzy searches, keyword searches. I mean, there's a lot going on in a text search. It's not that easy to implement. So yeah, you should use these tools for that, not DynamoDB.
Yeah, I agree. Got another question here from Niku about single table design. Can we design a social media app following single table design if a schema is stable? Absolutely. I mean, the difference between using one table for multiple entities. I mean, we're talking about a difference between using one table for different entities versus one table for each entity. And we kind of saw it's kind of mix of examples of that in our course already. You absolutely can. If the schema is stable, even if the schema is not stable, you can still make it work. It's just more difficult. I mean, to go from where I am now to somewhere, I can take a car, I can take a bike, I can take a taxi, I can walk. Obviously, I can get there somehow, but it's just how much effort I got to put into on getting there. I think that's the difference. And personally, I think you should if the requirements doesn't force you to go down a more difficult route, you should always go down the route of least resistance. I think you kind of owe yourself that. And let's see, there's another question I think also about this, sort of related to DiamondDB as well. Is it better to put many different services in one DiamondDB stream handler, or to use a dedicated handler for each service? I guess depends on what your definition for service here is. Typically, when you talk about microservices, the microservices should own their own database. So you wouldn't have multiple services accessing the same DiamondDB stream anyway. That would be a pretty big no for me, because if you don't own the database, especially for something like DiamondDB, then another team can make changes, and that's going to impact the events you're going to receive from DiamondDB stream, and that's going to make your life difficult to navigate that. The fact that you don't have autonomy over the database you have. and you're going to have the kind of common problems you have in the early attempts at microservices, where you have what we call a distributed monolith, whereby you have this implicit coupling between different services through the fact that they've got a shared database. But if you're talking about different sort of components, maybe different things we're doing in the app, ideally you would use a dedicated handler for each kind of thing you're doing, as opposed to doing multiple things. But in some cases, it's just difficult because, for example, the fact that you have no filtering. So if there is filtering of events, like you have with, say, EventBridge or SNS, then I'll definitely say, you should follow single responsibility principle in terms of deciding how where you have one handler or multiple handlers. But because of the fact you're dealing with something like DiamondDB streams and Kinesis streams as well, which both have a limit on the number of subscribers you can have per stream, which means that your hands are kind of tied if you need to do 10 things, which means that, well, you can't do it if you follow single responsibility principle, in which case you kind of have to condense things and I guess put them into put multiple responsibility into the same stream handler. Or most likely you probably shift the events out to a different event source, so that for example, if you have lots of different subscribers interested in different events, then maybe what you do is you have a one stream handler attached to the DiamondDB table, and then that handler is going to translate DiamondDB stream events like insert, update, and remove into domain events like user created, user profile updated, order placed, things like that. Then you can then have those other services or other things would handle individual events, as opposed to trying to squeeze lots of different things into one stream handler. At least that's the approach I would take if when it comes to dealing with something like that. Let's see. So Eduardo got a question here on our Twitter. The query get my profile returns the type my profile because there's only one type of user. If I had two different profiles, host and owner, how do you recommend implementing that? I guess depending on how different I think we just lost Gerard. I'll wait for him to reconnect. Maybe he's got some connection issues. So I guess it depends. It depends on how different the profiles look. So if it's just a case of host having some additional fields, then I may just have like a Boolean flag. But if it's a case that they have completely different set of fields, or they are drastically different, and you don't want some of the properties on one to leak into the other, then I will probably do what we've done so far in terms of separating them into different types. So you have different type names, so that when you know how we have in the same tweets table, we have tweets and retweets and replies. They are all different types, so have different different properties, but it's in the same table, and we sort of kind of encode the type name into the data that we put into the DiamondDB table. So that's the approach I'll probably take, and if I'm dealing with different profile types. If it's just a case of, okay, it's the same profile anyway, so the same user can have can be both a host and owner, and I just, depending on the circumstance, I want to return it as one or the other, then I would use I'll just do what we've done so far already, where you have both my profile and profile. One is for public, one's for yourself, or private, I guess. But both are the same. The same role in the DiamondDB table. It's just what data points gets returned to the caller, depending on whether or not you are looking at your own profile or you're looking at somebody else's profile. If that's the case, then the approach we've taken so far will work as well, which, if you recall, requires a bit of a custom VTL code or code in your Lambda function to inject a type name for the appropriate situations. Got a question here. Should we from Zhang Da? Should we worry about adding test data to Algolia when running tests, especially during GitHub builds? A short answer is yes, you should, because the fact that with Algolia, the pricing is based on what do you call it, units. So, and the units are calculated based on the number of records you have in Algolia, as well as the number of search operations you're doing. Okay.
Oops, sorry.
I think you got disconnected.
I'm back.
Yeah, it's fine. So just talking about whether or not we should worry about adding test data to Algolia. And yeah, because Algolia is going to well, potentially charge you more if you end up having lots of test data in Algolia. So in those cases, then I will be more careful in terms of capturing the data that's been added, and then having in the teardown step of your test, remove those data. So maybe some kind of a middleware layer in your test code, so that anytime you're adding data, you're putting them somewhere, and then at the end of the test, you run something to remove all of them, or maybe you run it as part of every single test suite. You've probably seen the before all and after all that we use in the test suite. So you can have something that captures the data that you created as part of running these tests, and then at the end of it, you delete them from the database. Which, when you delete them from the database, because of the fact that you've got the stream handler attaching, well, syncing data changes to Algolia, you should also delete them from Algolia as well. Let's see. Oh, okay, a follow-up from Dave. I'm using DiamondDB Stream to fire SNS events with different services being affected by the different. Yeah. So that makes sense. I guess the only thing I'll probably add to that is that nowadays it's probably better to use Event Bridge as opposed to SNS topics, because you have a lot more flexibility in terms of the filtering, because you can filter by content as opposed to have to only filter by message attributes, which often requires both some conversation between the subscriber and the publisher to agree on what attributes gets included, so that the subscriber can filter on the attributes. Or you end up with many different topics, which then becomes another case of this, like almost like a topic discovery, where you got to figure out, okay, I want this event when I want to find out, I want to subscribe to events when an order gets created. How do I go? Where do I find that event? Which topic do I need? And then figuring out what attributes are there, and whether or not it has the attributes I need to be able to filter for the specific event I'm looking for. Maybe, for example, I'm only looking for orders where the order value is greater than $100, because we're running some special promotion. The only people that order, $100 worth of in a single order qualifies for something like that. Whereas if you have a single event bus, then all the events where to get it, and you can use something like this. The Event Bridge has got the schema registry as well, so you can register. So it's got both schema registry and the discovery. So you can discover the schema for your events, and then everyone can then just look at the schema registry and see, okay, right, I'm interested in the order created events, and then of that event, there's these are the properties. Oh, there's the order value, and I can create a filter and subscribe to the event bus with a filter that says only give me events related to orders being created whose value is greater than $100 or whatever. So it just gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of the filtering you can have. Let's see. Got a question, a really good question here from Dave again. Will the current tweets table design result in the hot partition always being the leading edge of the table because all UUIDs will be closed? So in terms of the way the partitions work, so UUIDs is randomized. So in terms of the fact that they may be close, so I think you're confusing in terms of the partitioning with how S3 partitions data. So S3 is partitions data based on prefix. So if you look at our UUIDs, not a UUID, our ULIDs, a lot of the first couple of characters are all the same. So if you're talking about S3, then that can potentially lead to hot partitions because of the fact that they have the same prefix. But I think when it comes to DiamondDB, because it's hashing the string value of the key. So the fact that they have the same prefix doesn't have that big an impact. So it should still hash really well. I guess I'm happy to be proven wrong. If someone has got some examples in terms of how ULIDs affects partitioning, I'd love to see that. But I've not seen any problems with ULIDs in the real world, because they are still randomized, including the last the trailing couple of characters. That is all randomized already. Even if your sort of timestamp bit is the same, there's always going to be the last couple of characters are random. Let's see. Good question from Akshay here. How to share code between different services in serverless. So normally what I do is I'll use npm. I'll publish or whatever language you're working with. I'll publish them to npm so that different services, if you've got shared libraries that need to be used by different services. When you say serverless services, I mean like a microservice where you got like a deployment unit where you've got a serverless project, you've got one serverless or YAML. And everything. So within that repo, I guess of code. If that is sort of the sort of scope of your service, then yeah, I will use npm to share code. But if you're talking about having different things in the same repo and the sharing code, just gonna be a case of having like the lib folder we have in our project structure. So you can just share code like that, no problem. In terms of using, you may also hear a lot of AWS people. I guess when I say AWS people, I really mean a lot of the developer advocates or AWS telling you should use Lambda layers. My suggestion would be don't. And I think we covered that in one of the lessons. I recently wrote about that as well. With Lambda layers, there's a lot of problems in terms of the fact that it has no semantic versioning, so you can't communicate the changes from one version to another. There's no, and also the fact that it doesn't work. It doesn't really work with compiled languages like your Java and the .NET. It also means that if you want to test your code locally, like what we're doing with our integration tests, and you still need those libraries locally. So the fact that you've got some code that exists in your AWS environment, when you run your just test, just doesn't know about that, so it doesn't know. So it needs those libraries to be local, which means that you still need to have them. You still have to import them through npm somehow anyway. So it doesn't remove npm from your stack, and the fact that you can only have 5 layers per function. So it's really quite a big problem if you want to use Lambda layers as your package manager. So I'm putting a link in the chat on a blog post I wrote recently about how you should be using Lambda layers, which is basically what we've done in this course, to use it just as optimization during deployment, so that you don't ship the same package every single time, especially if that package is quite big. So the serverless layers plugin that we're using with the server framework is a great way to use Lambda layers to as a way to optimize and reduce the number of times you need to ship the same 50 meg package up to AWS every single time you want to do deployments. So I hope that answers your question in terms of sharing code. Just do the same thing that you normally do with, I guess, when you've got microservices, even when they're running on containers. I mean, how do you share code there? You share them via package managers like npm. Let's see. So I guess I've got a related question. Any tips to clean up the DiamondDB table and our goalie after running the integration and end-to-end test? So like I mentioned earlier, if you run those tests and you're generating test data and you worry about those test data accumulating, then what we should do is to introduce those teardown steps. Which let me stop look at our code again and see whether or not we have any teardown steps. So we have one in the notifications.js in the where we test the notifications we have a after all step that calls subscription dot unsubscribe. So you can do the same approach and use the after all step to clean up any data that you inserted during the test. So what that means is that you have to have some way, just have an array that tracks the data that you created during the test, and then at the end of the test, you in the after all step, you will delete them. You will have some kind of a teardown script that deletes the data that was created during the test. All right, so lots of questions. Let's see, got another one here from Eduardo. I'd like to query DiamondDB to find items between the date range. Okay. Should I create a created at field or use the ID generated with URID? So DiamondDB, so I guess it depends. DiamondDB queries works by locking down on a single hash key and then applying and then you can do a range on the sort key. So if your ID, if you're talking about ID, then ID is the hash key. So you can't really do a query against that. But you can say given and but otherwise, yeah, you could use the UIDs because UIDs are already sorted. So you can say based, if you can work out the kind of the prefix for the date range you want, because they'll be encoded in the ULID anyway, and then you can say just do the string range between the two dates or the equivalent UID prefix that you're going to get that you get for those dates. So if you can do that, then that's great. Then you don't have to have a created at field just so that you can you can filter them. So that would be my approach if it's possible. But again, that's all predicated on whether or not you're talking about DiamondDB query, which is given a hash key, apply some condition on the sort key. You can do the same thing with DiamondDB scans as well, but obviously scans are not something that you should be doing regularly, at least not as part of any sort of user-triggered actions. Dave here, do you use just mocks in any unit or integration tests? Any reason for or against? And that's a great question. So the short answer is I don't tend to use mocks, but there's a lot of I guess the devil in the detail because for our unit test, really the unit tests that we are writing are just for the VTL templates. We unit testing the VTL, mostly the VTL templates. There's a couple other functions where I think the get upload URL, for example, where we're not talking to any services. There's no IO involved. So for those, we have some unit tests to check whether or not the land function is returning the right thing. But other than that, the unit test in this course has been mostly about the VTL template itself. In practice, when I'm writing a lot of Lambda functions, I also don't write an awful lot of the unit tests, where essentially, you just, except for when I've got small bits of code modules, often like the share modules in my lib folder, I will write some unit tests for those because those are there's no IO call, it's not calling any other services. For those, I tend to write a lot of unit tests for those, but not often. I don't often have unit tests in my projects unless there's some shared code that's or some business logic that's complicated enough that deserves some unit tests of their own. Integration tests, I do a lot of them. The ones that we have in the course, whereby we are essentially we're running the Lambda function locally, and then we're having it talk to the real AWS services, and then we inspect the side effects it creates because of. The reason why I don't mock is that I've seen a lot of tests whereby the only thing that's worth testing is the call you're making to DiamondDB. Are you constructing the right query expression and things like that? Other than that, there's not a lot of logic in the code that's really worth testing. But then if you're mocking out that interaction to DiamondDB, then you're not really testing anything. You're just testing if your mock is returning what you told it to, which of course is going to do that. So for those, I don't use mocks for AWS services or any other sort of third-party services for that matter, because the important thing is to test the integration works, and I want to make sure that it works before I deploy, so that if I've got some syntax error in the DiamondDB request, or if I've got some misconfiguration in the Algolia request I'm sending, I want to find out before I have to deploy and then figure out there's something wrong there. So my integration test will help me catch those before I deploy. And where I do use mocks is when it comes to like for other services in terms of I/O, is for internal services. So if I'm working in a large company or large team where there may be lots of different microservices, one thing you find is that unlike those AWS services or Algolia or other sort of SaaS products you use, your own company's services are not as stable. They break way more often. In fact, especially in those test environments or dev environments, they break all the time, or at least the subtle changes constantly happening. And you don't want to be in a situation whereby one team makes a mistake, deploys some change that breaks something, or there's a bug, and then to their own dev environment, and then other teams use those environments, and then suddenly everyone's test is broken. I mean, there are different ways to mitigate that, but then for each of those ways you can mitigate it, they have their own problems. So it's easier to just create mock libraries. Have the service team publish the mock libraries for their own service, so that as they change the schema, as they change the behavior, they will update the mocks, the mock libraries. So like that's so important. And also it means that if you've got 10 teams depending on the same service, you don't have the same mock being created 10 times by different teams with a slightly different understanding of the behavior of the service. So if you're like building microservices and your service being used by other teams, then it should be so useful, so helpful if that team will also own the client library. They'll publish a nice looking library, and then and also API spec, and also possible like some kind of a mock as well, so that people can easily can reuse them. Failing that, if everyone's just mocking HTTP requests, and because you're not using a service client library, then I guess that's a moot point. But then I'll still mock those internal services, just because they're much more volatile. They break a lot more often, and you don't want to stop everyone else because you made a mistake. So yeah.
I like to add a couple of scenarios that you may want to introduce mocks. One is for any resource intensive task, maybe a machine learning branch that might trigger some heavy calculations, or even if you are reaching to an external service that has some cost, you probably want to mock that and then just forget about it. But yeah, I mean, it just depends, but usually you would use mocks for those two scenarios.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also, I forgot to mention another one as well, which is if you want to test the failure cases that are really hard to reproduce with a real thing, like DiamondDB throttling or things like that, then you also want to introduce mocks for those, because again, those conditions are hard to replicate without some really deliberate setup of your environment and then generating load and all of that. So for your testing, you should use the mocks for those as well. Really good catch, Gerard.
No worries. I'm here. Yeah. I'm here.
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of detail. There's a lot of the devil is in the details here. Do you mind sharing the leverage cost with DiamondDB you have monthly with that social network you built? I like to build something with a similar stack. It really depends. Just because I told you that the cost for the social network that I built, it doesn't mean that you're going to get the same thing. So I don't want to I don't want to give it to you because of that, because I don't want you to think that because Yan built the social network and he's paying I don't know $5 a month for DiamondDB for 200,000 requests per day. That's what I'm going to be seeing as well. It's not going to be the same. You could be paying nothing. You could be paying 100 times that. It really depends on your traffic pattern, depending on how your caching strategy. I mean, for that social network I built, I was able to get over 99% cache hit rate, which means that most of the requests, luckily, most of the data are cacheable. And so we were able to get essentially 99% the cache hit rate, which means most requests doesn't hit DiamondDB, most requests doesn't hit Lambda function. So yeah, we were able to cut our costs down way down because of that. But that may not be the case for you for your application. So I don't want you to baseline your application on something that works differently. Always test your own account, your own use case. All right, so last 10 minutes. Does the multi-account strategy also apply to Algolia and other third-party services? Yes, I think you should use a different. So with Algolia, you can actually have different indexes in the same tenant, but it's probably worth having different tenant anyway, just in terms of the security isolation we talked about. If someone managed to get access to your Algolia tenant, they don't. Again, because somehow they got hold of your API keys or whatnot, so you're protected in terms of that particular tenancy. Same with things like Auth0 or other services using as much as you can. I guess try to use a different tenancy for different environments. Maybe not per team. Again, for things like user management, it probably wouldn't make sense for you to have different instances of, say, Auth0 for each microservice and each environment, but you probably have one Auth0 tenants for each environment, just not for each service. Let's see. Do you have any recommendations or best practices link for multilingual applications? I don't. I actually not done anything myself. Have you done any sort of multilingual applications, Gerard?
Yes. I mean, there are different approaches. It just depends on what framework you have. Usually, there's a couple of approaches depending if you need to change the language live, like dynamically, or if you can just prepackage a language on your build and then just deploy that. I mean, it's mainly these two scenarios. So one of them will include all of the languages, and then you will be switching between the languages live dynamically. The other one will be on the build process. You will have different languages, you will build for those, and then if you change the language, you just switch to a different deployment. So depending which of these two, then you need to look at how to implement that. But these are the main two scenarios that I've seen. But then it depends what you need. But yeah, these are mainly the two scenarios, and then you would build the resources for a neutral scenario, and then you would translate that neutral scenario, usually in English, and then you will translate those resources into the different languages, and it just neutralize the app in terms of resources. So then all of the UI will be pointing to IDs, which will be like tokens in a neutral language, and then you would just switch that to the language that the user has on their browser or on their configuration. So that's a quick going through, but yeah, there's few resources. It's just something that you need to consider. I mean, it's not trivial, but yeah, it's totally doable. I mean, I've done it with Angular, Vue. Haven't done it with React, but yeah, you should be able to do it with any framework.
Yeah, I guess now they mentioned it. I've done the backend side of this where we return a lot of the I think that when I worked on in the games industry before, we did quite a few of these where I think it's the first approach you mentioned, where we return a token, an ID token, instead of actual string, and then we'll have that some kind of language mapping so that that ID token, like I don't know, like catchphrase 1, and that gets mapped to a different different actual text that gets substituted in the front end. I think that's what we did for a lot of the games.
Yeah, usually you use a templated approach.
Right.
So then it's multi-language. So you just have like a placeholder, like %1, %2, because some languages, they have different composition. Because if you take the words, maybe in German or maybe in another language, it's just completely all messed up. So you need like a template approach where you can take the tokens and then move them around. But I mean, there's a lot of resources. I can maybe find. I mean, if you just mention like what framework and what is the mix, I can try to find some resources for you. But yeah, totally, you can implement that. No problem.
Cool. And I guess I've seen a lot of websites that use the second approach you mentioned, where like there's different URL for different languages. Like if you go to, I think Uber Eats does this. There's like a slash NL dash EN if you want to have the Dutch language, but then or sorry, the Dutch website, but then have the English instead, or the NL they have the Dutch version of the Dutch website. And
yeah. The thing is, it can get complicated because sometimes these are managed by different people. So then it's not only the language; it may be completely different. So it's it just depends how the organization is structured. Maybe that goes to a completely different set of features, and it's not the same app. I mean, it depends what you are thinking. Maybe you are thinking, oh, it's exactly the same app in a different language, but it could be completely different. The options may be different. The advertisements will be different. I mean, it just depends how the requirements for that specific app. So it can get tricky. It can get like surprising. Like, okay, what is this? Well, this is Spain. It's a different organization.
All right. So again, a quick question. Okay, how many things have in common DDD and serverless? So I guess when you say DDD, I guess you're talking about domain-driven design. So domain-driven design is a way to capture. One it talks about the sort of ubiquitous language that everyone uses to describe different concepts and entities and whatnot in your domain. This is about modeling your application more than how you build it. And I guess also same with microservices and serverless. Microservices is a way for you to approach architecture, having different autonomous services as opposed to one big monolith, and then. And serverless, serverless is a type of technology that you can use to build microservices, or you can use to build the monolith applications. I guess nowadays you probably see most people building microservices and serverless. You can use serverless technology to build microservices, or you can use container technologies, or you can use the VMs. So the two of them are, I guess, they're orthogonal, where domain DDD is about defining your domain, modeling your application, and then you got microservices in terms of how you structure your application in terms of the high-level architecture, and those two DDD is often applied in the context of microservices in that case, in terms of deciding where's the boundary for your individual services or microservices. And then you got serverless, which is the kind of technology where you don't pay for uptime, you're not managing servers, and then you use them to build out those microservices within the domains you've identified using DDD. I hope that answers your question. They're not the same thing. They're all sort of different concepts that's got some interesting intersection. Running out of time now. Let's answer this last one. Hey guys, I recently moved out of the code base from Amplify to Firebase. The reason is that the Cognito does not support logging in and registering user with only a phone number. Any advice on that? I thought you could register a user with only phone number. So if that's not the case, so so even if that's not the case, what you could do with Cognito is instead of having the Cognito being the user management system, what you could also do is use something like Auth0, which is what I've done for a project, and then the user Cognito as the way to so protect your AppSync API. So what you could do is you can link Cognito and federate the identity bit to Auth0 through SAML. So you can configure Cognito such that it does a SAML federation. So essentially, when someone logs in, Cognito will be the thing Cognito is a log on your API. But the key, when you want to get the key, the user have to sign into Auth0. So when it comes to logging in, Cognito say, actually, I don't own the identity. I'm gonna forward the user to Auth0, and then the user can log in with Auth0, and then that gets passed back to Cognito, and then Cognito is gonna issue its own token, and the user is gonna actually get a token from Cognito, which they can then use to access your API. So that's the way to work around that. But I imagine they may be working. I think they may release Lambda authorizer for AppSync at some point, which is one of the things that's still kind of available on API Gateway, but not on the AppSync. That way you can then just write your own authentication logic, and so you can use Auth0 and just sidestep Cognito altogether. But Cognito gives you some nice things that you can use with AppSync, like the user groups and things like that, so that you can have different roles within your application, all managed by mimicking using Cognito user groups. So let's see. Actually, let's got two more from Eduardo. Let's just finish that. We're a little bit over time, but that's okay. Eduardo says, I've been testing social login with Cognito, and I noticed that it duplicates the user if I sign up with Google and Facebook, even though they're the same emails. Any tips? So you can also link the users, but linking the user is a bit funky, and it's also funky just everywhere else as well. If you use Auth0, Auth0 does the same thing. After you created both users with Google and Facebook, you can then make a call to link the user. Where it gets a bit tricky is that Cognito lets you link user in the same request when the user gets created, but it then fails that initial sign-in attempt. So when you sign in and it creates a user with in Google, whatever, social sign in, it creates a user in the Cognito, and then you say, okay, I want to link it to my other account. But that only works if you have created a Cognito user by email and password first, and then you also failed the initial attempt to sign in using your social sign in. So it works, but with a heavy caveat. But that being said, it also kind of works like that in the Auth0 and other services as well. That they don't let you do the linking in one call. You have to make separate calls to link the user after the fact. In which case, it becomes one record as opposed to multiple records. So that's the difference in the Cognito, where they always show up as different different users, but you can always log in with the primary user or with any of the other users. And I think once you've had them linked, they're always going to return the ID of the primary user. So even if you log in using Facebook, the user ID that appears would be the primary user that you have created before. Okay, last one. Would you consider adding bonus content approaching Elasticsearch and plus AppSync? Goliath is really cool, but I feel like it'd be good to see an alternative with Elasticsearch since it's still more used. I'll say no right now, because we already extended the content quite a bit, and there's so much that me and Gerard are struggling to catch up in terms of the schedule that we had in mind in terms of when we're going to finish this thing by. I may put up blog posts and stuff like that in the future. But I think if you're looking for Elasticsearch and AppSync, the challenge is not so much with Elasticsearch and AppSync itself. You can actually find the feature documentations that it covers how to use Elasticsearch with AppSync. A lot of the things that I'm going to have that you have to teach with Elasticsearch is just about Elasticsearch itself, which is quite a big topic. That's something that I don't feel qualified to really teach, and also I think it'd be too much of effort to include that in this particular course.
Yeah, I think the connection. I've done Elasticsearch for a couple of years, so I can fill in, and I would say that the connection is really light. So there's no much difference between Algolia connection and Elasticsearch connection. It's just a little adapter changing, the operations for indexing and updating entries. And I mean, it's quite light, but yeah, as you were mentioning, the moment you need to build your queries, then you need to learn Elasticsearch, and then there may be differences from what we are using with Algolia. But I would say the difference are minor. But of course, yeah, you need to cover it separately. It's not.
Yeah, learning Elasticsearch itself is a much bigger job, and teaching is a really big job as well, especially when the APIs change quite often. As I think they're version 14 now, or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I think that's a challenge with teaching Elasticsearch, and something that we can cover. But yeah, thanks everyone for showing up and for all the questions. Hope that you find them useful. But yeah, we'll see you in the course. And if you got any follow-up questions, let us know in the forum as well. And yeah, hopefully see you next time. Cheers, guys. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.